Hello. So my name's Felix, and I'm going to talk about our work on early learning in situated artificial agents. Now, deep reinforcement learning is a machine learning technique that's powered a lot of recent progress in AI, and is a particular focus at Deepmind, where we're from. Thanks to DeepRL, for instance, a system with no prior knowledge can develop sufficient expertise in chess to beat the world's best players, just by acquiring experience playing against itself. Perhaps unsurprisingly, such powerful learning systems, whose computation and representation is based on large numbers of interacting neurons, have recently become of interest in neuroscience. While these sorts of approach sets are perhaps not mainstream in neuroscience, applying them in cognitive science is definitely even less common. Things may be starting to change a bit, so here's some really interesting recent work from Alison Gopnik's lab, in which the learning and behavior of children and agents are actually compared when they're both navigating 3D simulated environments. Now, the high-level motivation for doing this sort of work derives to a large extent from the embodied cognition perspective, the idea that cognition is intimately connected to both our bodies and the world around us, and that it doesn't really make sense to study cognition in the absence of an environment that responds directly to our actions. Some recent work has started to build a case for embodiment being of central importance to machine learning, particularly behind those efforts to replicate really important human behaviors. So as an example of this, we had some recent work which showed significant, and in many cases substantial, differences between the cognitive and learning behavior of an agent trained in an embodied simulated environment versus an equivalent static model that had the same architecture and the same number of parameters and the same learning algorithm, but was just trained in a passive manner by being fed data. With all that in mind, one of the main objectives of this talk is to let you know about Deepmind Lab, which is a publicly available and highly configurable 3D world for AI and cognitive science research. An agent that operates in DM Lab has a radically simplified interface with the environment compared to a real human or animal. In particular, it just can take one of 8 discrete actions. So that's up and down, making a small movement to the right or the left, and then moving the head or strafing to the left and things like that. But importantly, each of these actions does have a sort of a very small continuous effect on the environment around it, even though there's only 8 discrete choices that the agent can make. And another simplifying assumption that we make in this work is, of course, that the agent has an episodic existence. So that means that its experience of the world is sort of chopped up into quite neat parcels of time. So at the first time step in this environment, in an episode, for instance, the agent might receive visual stimulus, and that visual stimulus, importantly, is a continuous valued representation of what it's looking at. So that's, in this work, an 84 by 84 by 3 array, colored array, visual representation of continuous valued pixels. It also gets a language string which represents the instruction in this work. So that might be something like find the green ball. And then at that time step, it necessarily must take an action. So that action might be just the very discrete look left action. There's 8 of those possible at each time step. So of course, as the episode unrolls, we move to the next time step. The agent receives a different visual experience, potentially a different language instruction, although that doesn't happen in this work, and needs to make another action. And then the sort of experiments we're going to discuss last about 60 time steps. And at the end, the agent may or may not also receive a different type of stimulus in the environment. That's a non-zero reward. So in this case, the environment's actually configured to chuck out a positive reward if the agent executes a behavior which leads to the environment recognizing that the instruction has been followed correctly. And then it also chucks out a negative reward, potentially, if the agent does something that tells the environment that the instruction has been sort of done incorrectly. And then to learn in an environment like that, we need a particular type of machine learning model with a particular API, input-output interface. So in this case, we use a very small convolutional neural network to process the visual stimulus coming at the agent. And we use a very small recurrent neural network to process the string language input given to the agent, because of course we don't know in advance how long that might be. So the recurrent neural network has this arbitrary length interface allowing it to convert that arbitrary length string into a fixed length memory state representation. And then the output of those in our baseline model is just concatenated together, so that provides a dense code representing the visual and the language stimulus at a given time step, and that is passed to the agent's memory core. So the memory core is another recurrent neural network with an LSTM memory gating system, a long short-term memory system, allowing it to retain information over longer time steps. And conditioned on the state of that memory, which of course itself is conditioned on the observations seen by the agent at many time steps prior to that point, the agent what makes its decision about which action to take by representing a probability distribution over the 8 actions from which a specific action is sampled and passed to the environment. And of course, the particular identity of that action determines how the environment changes and therefore what observation the agent gets at the next step. So anyway, we set up this agent, and we actually started this work in 2016, so a long time ago, and no one had really done anything like this with respect to language learning. So it took us months and months to get the agent to learn anything. And the first thing we got it to learn was a somewhat simple notion of large and small. So here you can see we trained an agent in a very small room to move around and find the object which was either larger or smaller, depending on what the instruction told it to do. And of course, the positions of all the objects was always randomized, so the agent couldn't just associate large with going in one specific direction. It had to actually look at the 2 objects and make some sort of prediction. And then we upgraded from there slowly to knowledge of different colors. So here the agent gets told which color object it should be going for and eventually moves towards that object. And then finally to shape words. So here the agent is the objective for the agent is being specified in terms of the shape of the object that the agent needs to move towards. And then after another couple of months and lots of experimentation, we finally managed to get sort of a more complete knowledge of language into the agent. Of course, a very specific constrained language, but nevertheless, it has some properties of natural language. For example, in this case, we got the agent to do a task where the order of the words actually mattered to whether or not the agent satisfied the task, because the agent has to get something like the pink object in the green room. And if it gets the colors wrong if it gets the order of the words wrong in understanding that command, then it will pick up the wrong, or it will necessarily pick up maybe the pink thing in the green room and therefore fail at the task. Now, once we train that agent, we can start to do some interesting science. So in particular, we started to think about how well it could generalize, and we actually found that rather nicely, there was this sort of notion of emergent compositionality coming out of the agent. So to show this, we set up a little training test split where we ran the agent simultaneously on testing episodes where it wasn't able to learn from those episodes, but they were just there to evaluate its behavior, and then on training episodes from which the agent does actually learn. And the training episodes involved instructions like find a red ladder, find a green mug, or find a blue pencil. So color, shape, adjective, noun, compounds. And it also included instructions that pertain just to individual color or just to individual shape, like the ones we showed the video of before. And the test episodes contained instructions involving held out shapes. So the agent needed to interpret held out shape color pairs. So the agent needed to interpret instructions that it had actually never been trained to interpret, but importantly, they did involve individual words that the agent was aware of. And what you see in the curve is that the red line is performance on the held out test set, and that is performance over time as the agent learns. So actually, quite pleasingly, its ability to do that, chance here, so it gets if it gets the correct object, it gets a positive reward of 1 or 10, and if it gets an incorrect object, it gets -10. So chance here would be 0. So the red line going well above 0 tells us that it's well above chance at its ability to recombine its knowledge of colors and shapes into make a coherent understanding of these sorts of compounds that it's never actually been trained to follow before. Now, one thing you might have noticed in those curves was that learning takes a long time in an agent like this. We initialize the agent with random weights, so it gets all of its experience from interacting in the environment that we've set up. There's no prior knowledge in the agent. We don't pre-train its visual ability or anything like that. And you can see that in order for any sort of learning to be take off, we need of the order of 100,000 of these trials episodes. So that's not particularly realistic model of learning, even if the model of behavior that we showed might be somewhat realistic. But on the other hand, we were able to start identifying aspects that could help to speed up the acquisition of word learning in the agent. And of course, there's some nice parallels here, very loose parallels that could be made with the acquisition of measurement of vocabulary size in children as they develop. So in this curve, you can see that the red line is an agent which starts learning from scratch with random weights. And obviously, it takes a long time to start getting a higher average reward than 0. And then the green line is an agent which was previously trained on 2 different words that are not in the test set that we're recording in this graph. So the ability of the agent on those 2 words is not recorded in this curve, but it does have weights that were previously trained to do a task that required the agent to know the meaning of 2 different shape words. And then the blue line is an equivalent agent to the green line, but where this prior knowledge was of 20 shape words, different shape words to the one that are charted in this curve. But nevertheless, the agent has more prior knowledge. It has prior knowledge of 20 words. And what we can see clearly is that the more words the agent knows already, the faster its learning of new words takes off. Now, this is perhaps not surprising, right? Because the agent needs to optimize lots of things which are generic, lots of knowledge and lots of abilities that are generic and independent of the specific words that the agent needs to know in this chart, right? So, for example, in the red curve, you can see a lot of time is probably taken up just learning how to move its head, learning how to make sensible, complex motor actions that allow it to navigate the world, and learning how to see very sort of object generics, visual features in the pixel space that's coming at the agent from the environment. And once it's got that sort of general knowledge, it can move on to the word and vision object specific knowledge that's required to learn specific words. And the fact that that early knowledge sort of complements the later knowledge is somewhat exhibited by the accelerating rate of word learning we see in this curve. But there's not, so the environment and the prior knowledge given through the environment can be one way of speeding up word learning in the agent. But is that the only way? Now, there's a huge amount of debate in the literature, of course, about whether or not something like reinforcement or reinforcement learning is actually a good way of characterizing child's word learning. And it certainly seems fair to say that there's a consensus that the explicit signal in the environment that language has been understood or used correctly is not something that's always present. And children probably are learning from other signals. So one thing we did in this work was we investigated the unsupervised signals for getting more out of the environment and speeding up word learning. And the way we did that was by means of this reward prediction auxiliary learning, where the agent reviews its experience at the end of every episode, and then conditioned on the last few frames of the episode, makes a separate prediction of whether or not, looking back at the experience it's just had, whether or not it should have actually got a positive reward or a negative reward. So essentially, it's a sort of question-answering auxiliary learning signal where the agent looks back at its prior experience and says, did that go well or did that go badly, given that that was the instruction I was given? And when the agent does that, we actually find that word learning takes off a lot quicker. So this is a separate signal from the reinforcement, the reward coming from the environment, but it actually helps the agent aggregate knowledge relevant to word learning much more quickly. And so word learning takes off more quickly in the agent in that way. And then finally, we did a very rudimentary experiment, which I think exhibits the ability of reapplying common experimental paradigms from cognitive science directly to an agent like this to understand the agent's behavior better. So in this case, we studied a well-known phenomenon called the shape bias. And essentially, we wanted to ask the question, well, if we trained an agent that object you see there on the left of the slide is called a triangle, and then we presented it with 2 other things and gave the stimulus triangle, the instruction triangle, but those 2 things were a yellow triangle and a green diamond. Which one of those 2 things would the agent go for? So we set up that precise experiment in our environment, which is essentially a copy of the well-known experiment done by humans to identify shape bias. And of course, what we found is that we could actually get the agent to exhibit whatever type of bias we wanted, just depending on how many times during its training phase, whether or not it was exposed to more shape words or more color words. So this, I guess, highlights the importance of our environment in perhaps determining the sorts of biases we might observe in the world. And of course, generally speaking, in a language, there are many more shape words than color words. And in fact, if you look at corpus of child-directed speech, we see that children are exposed to many more shape words than color words as they grow up. So it may well be there's this evidence towards the environmental factors underlining some of the biases that we see in agents. So I've come to the end of the talk, but I just wanted to conclude by saying that, in this work, we've shown that it's possible to model some aspects of cognitive development and processing in increasingly realistic interactive environments, and that by doing so, we can hopefully marry a degree of ecological realism with experimental control. Agents can be subjected to similar experimental analyses as humans, and we can even do things like more invasive probes where we change the actual activations or neurons within the network of the agent and see how it behaves. Of course, doing things like that in humans or animals is questionable from an ethical point of view, but doing it in these agents is hopefully not doing any harm to anyone. So there's lots of exciting science we can do using this paradigm. I hope that's given a bit of a flavor of it, and I'd like to thank my amazing collaborators. Look forward to questions.